Chapter 2. Howie was a little late in joining me. He'd spent a half hour rummaging through a pile of crates, which some grocery company had dumped on a vacant lot. It had been a half hour well spent, though, for he'd beaten the rats to an orange, only half decayed. He cut out the bad part with his pocket knife and divided what was left between us, smiling his big smile full of pleasure that he was able to give me a treat. I wondered if Joey's cat had been as grateful for her pan of milk as I was for that bite of orange. After a minute, I told Howie of my plans. I can't take it any longer, I told him. I'm hitting the roads, and I hope I never see Chicago again. Or my dad. Or... Bitterness rolled up like a fist and pounded inside me. Or my mother either. I added, she's all for the old man. Well, I'll clear out. They can't be any happier to get rid of me than I am to be through with them. Howie shrugged. I suppose my family difficulties seemed rather bland to him. Then he answered as casually as if I had suggested walking around the block. Well, I guess I'll be going with you, Josh. But what about your mother? Howie's eyes could get icy. Are you trying to be funny? He asked. No, I just want to be sure that someone isn't going to set the cops on the trail of two runaways. Well, be at ease. We were silent for a minute. Then I said, we can make it, can't we, Howie? He came out of this icy mood into a gay enthusiasm as if he'd done a mental handspring. Of course we can make it. You know, in a way, we're a couple of the luckiest guys around here because we've got something that people want. No matter how hard times are, people still want music. And we've got it, Josh. We're a notch or two above just pretty good. And you know it. We'll find some place, a speakeasy, a restaurant, a dance hall, some place where people will pay to hear the kind of music we make. I felt excitement growing in me. We'll head for the smaller towns, Howie. Chicago's too big and ugly. Chicago's too close to my old man. We'll head for the smaller towns that maybe ain't hit so hard. Right, the smaller towns, west, maybe south and west, where the winters won't be so long. Lord, I've been wanting to see the west all my days. We'll pick us out an empty boxcar. We were feverish with our plans. We'd talked excitedly, interrupting one another with new ideas. Nothing seemed impossible during that hour when Howie and I sat on the curb and made our plans. Then there was suddenly a distraction. I had paid no attention to the shadowy figure of a boy approaching until he stopped and stood before us. It was my brother. What are you doing here, Joey? I asked gruffly. I'm going with you, Josh, he said as quietly as Howie had spoken an hour before. How do you know I'm going anywhere? I know you're going to leave home. I heard you tell Mom. And you listen to me, Josh. I'm going with you. And you listen to me, Joey. You're going to do nothing of the sort. You're too young. You couldn't keep up with guys our age. You've got sense enough to know that. Howie, make him let me go with you. Joey turned away from me. His voice pled with Howie. I think I knew at that minute what the decision would be. Joey knew what he was doing when he turned to Howie. This was his friend, and he knew it. They had often sat on the school steps during late afternoons in summer when no one was around, and Howie had shown Joey how to pick out a few chords on the banjo. Sometimes he'd ask Joey to sing, and he'd make his banjo sing too, and their faces would be all shined up with delight. Howie was kinder to Joey than I was, more patient, more respectful of Joey as an individual. He looked at me when Joey made his plea. Why can't he go with us, Josh? He just can't. He wouldn't be able to keep up with us. He'd be a nuisance, and you know it. We've made our plans, Howie, and I think they'll work, but not if we have to have a kid along. He can sing, Howie said, as if to himself. He's got a good, clear voice, a little off-pitch now and then, but nice. Lots of people will pay to hear a little kid sing who wouldn't notice older ones. Joey just might do all right for himself. I've told you, Howie, he can't go. I won't let him, and that's final. Maybe you and me could go it alone, Joey. Let old Josh stay here and boss people around if that's what he likes to do. You and me might get ourselves a lot of loose change if we practiced a little and got into the right spot. He grinned at Joey, and my brother grinned back in triumph. For a moment, I was furious with the both of them. But even in that minute, it struck me that if some artist could paint those two faces, both of them thin from two scanty meals during the past 2 years, but both of them bright with laughter, if some artist could have caught them at that minute, he could have made a picture that was really something. So it was settled, and late that night, Joey and I crawled out of our room with an old cardboard suitcase full of clothing, the remnants of a tattered blanket, and all the matches I could find. Matches, I felt, were very important. I had read a story somewhere of an expedition that appeared to be all set, everything packed and ready. Then it smashed, all because one little item had been forgotten. No matches. I hunted around and collected every one I could find. I was too excited to think about how grave a step we were taking. If I thought of Mom and Dad at all, it was with anger, which I sought to fan in order to keep up my courage. Nothing mattered except getting away. We joined Howie, who waited down in our alley with his banjo and a bundle of clothes tucked under his arm. The three of us slept in a park for a few hours that night. Then, very early the next morning, we found a Salvation Army kitchen open with no one else yet around. A big, tired-looking man shook his head at us, but he gave each of us a bowl of oatmeal. Then he told us not to come back. The food he handed out was for men who must wait in line to get to employment windows. It wasn't for runaway kids. Our experience that first day showed how right Howie had been in making me allow Joey to come with us. We stopped down on Randolph and Wabash earlier in the afternoon and tried our luck for the first time at the art of panhandling. That is, Joey and Howie tried it. They were right for it, both of them being small. Joey's blondness contrasting vividly with Howie's great dark eyes and sallow face. I drifted off into the crowd and watched the other two perform. Joey sang, his small face bright under the blonde hair that he had to brush out of his eyes from time to time. His voice was sweet and clear, a little thin, of course, and not always true to pitch, but with Howie covering up for him, he did all right. Howie, with his sense of showmanship, would run his fingers across the strings in a gay arpeggio and then grin up at Joey as if that flurry of notes was some pleasant secret between them. People stopped to watch them. Some smiled as they stood listening, and some sad faces looked sadder than ever. But a lot of people reached out to drop a nickel or a few pennies into Joey's outstretched cap. They collected 78 cents that afternoon. Then at twilight they joined me, and we moved on in triumph at our beginning. We bought hot dogs and a loaf of bread and still had money enough for some breakfast. We gloated as we ate. If Joey's singing with Howie's banjo could do that well for us, we were pretty sure that given the luck to find an available piano, Howie and I could make music that some restaurant owner or dance hall proprietor would pay us to do. Once in a while, I'd play popular numbers straight, I thought, and Joey could sing with us. I no longer underestimated Joey. He had done fine that afternoon. I felt happier than I had felt in weeks. We had found confidence down there on the corner of Randolph and Wabash, 78 cents worth of confidence, and the glow it gave us was a wonderful experience. When it grew dark, we huddled together under the steps of a stairway leading up to an L platform. We talked softly together for a while, and the words, "We can make it, I know we can make it," became a refrain. We didn't realize at first how many times we'd repeated those words, and when we did, we carried our refrain to ridiculous lengths and laughed at our own absurdity. Joey and Howie grew tired very early. They leaned against me for warmth and were soon asleep, but I sat there wide awake for a long time. Little gusts blew scraps of dirty newspaper and flurries of dust into my face from time to time. Overhead, the elevated trains rumbled so often that their noise finally became a familiar monotony of which I was barely conscious. Once a woman came and stood leaning against the pillar of the stair for a long time. She was so close I could have touched her dress, but she didn't see us. She was crying. She made me think of Kitty, and I was glad when she finally began climbing the steps up to the platform. Very late in the night, when the moonlight made it look like morning, a policeman came by. He stopped to look at us, but after one glance I kept my eyes closed, and he evidently decided to let us sleep. After a long time he walked away, very slowly. The next morning, after a better breakfast than we usually had at home, we started for the freight yards. We had money enough left for streetcar fare, and so, after some inquiries, we found the right car and rode out to the yards in style. We weren't too much concerned about money. We thought we'd ride as far as we could, the freight train. Then Howie and Joey could repeat their panhandling stunt, and we could eat until a real job could be located. We had the remainder of the loaf of bread we bought the night before. That would have to do us for the train ride. We found acres of tracks down in the freight yards. I had never known there were so many. We saw trains coming in and leaving, trains being loaded for a run, trains backing, lurching, forward, switching. Everything was confusion. Adding to the confusion was an army of men, many of them railroad workers, just as many others were loiterers like us. These men were looking around, sizing up the cars and their loads, waiting for the whistles that meant a train was about to start. When that signal came, they would run to leap into the car or swing up on an outer ladder and climb to the top of the train once the wheels had picked up speed. I asked a cautious question or two whenever I saw a face that looked friendly. There weren't many such. Men's faces seemed to be much alike that year, lean, scowling, and angry. One man who told me that he'd been a hobo for 15 years was friendly enough, however, and was willing to talk to us. When we told him we were headed west, he didn't question the vagueness of our west, but pointed out a train that told us it would leave for Iowa that afternoon, would get to Nebraska the next morning. That sounded good to us. That was west and far away from Chicago. I asked the hobo about the railroad detectives, the bulls of whom I'd heard a lot. Were they really brutal as many of the newspapers and magazine articles described them? Sometimes they were, he told me, especially when the higher-ups began to put on the pressure and a bull felt his job was in danger. He had seen bulls club men off the trains. He'd also seen an angry group of free riders seize a bull and throw him from the train. On the other hand, he'd seen riders and bulls sit together for long hours, chatting or playing cards as if everything were all above board and just fine. It all depended, he said. It all depended on your luck. I asked about the dangers. Yes, he'd seen kids, men too, but mostly kids, get killed if they were careless. Big loads of lumber or steel might shift with a sudden lurch of the train and crush an unwary rider. Some people misjudged the speed of a train and made their grab for the ladder or the open car too late. Legs were often crushed in accidents of that sort. A feeling of uneasiness chilled me. Uneasiness, especially for Joey. He was thin. Even to skinniness, he wasn't as active as most kids his age. He hadn't grown up accustomed to the leaping and climbing and bike riding that I had done as a youngster. He'd had too many years of illness for that. Howie was slender too and short, but he was an agile little guy who had survived Chicago's traffic and some of its worst slums. Howie could keep up with me, I was pretty sure, but I was worried about Joey. I decided against waiting until the freight started. We'd find an open car and hide until we were on our way. If the bulls discovered us and threw us off before we got moving, we'd just have to find another train. I couldn't see Joey undertaking a scramble that was dangerous, even for men who had jumped on moving trains for years. Howie agreed with me. We found an open car filled with big sacks of lime, which farmers used to fertilize their fields. There were some fairly good hiding places among these piles. Fairly good, that is, if a railroad bull happened to be lax in his car inspection. And, of course, that all depended on your luck. We jumped inside when we felt no one was watching, and in the hour of waiting for the train to start, not a soul came near us. We got to feeling pretty confident after a while, almost as if we had bought tickets for a ride somewhere out west. 3 men jumped into the car when the train began to pick up speed, but they didn't pay any attention to us. They looked very blue and tired. They didn't even talk to one another. We rattled out of Chicago, and in an hour or two we were passing farms and small towns. The fields, brown with withered corn stalks, looked ghostly as twilight closed in. We crossed rivers, most of them low and sluggish after the drought that had burned things up that summer. And then, finally, we were rushing through nothing but black night, with only the light from the engine, at least a mile ahead of our car, to cut the darkness. Talk lagged that night. All three of us were quiet, a little thoughtful. Once Howie stroked the strings of his banjo a few times, but somehow the chords sounded mournful. I felt as if I couldn't stand to hear them, and I was glad when he shook his head and laid the banjo aside. Joey had charge of the leftover bread. He took it out after a while, and we cut it up into chunks with Howie's knife. We ate it very slowly, chewing each bite a long time to stretch out the experience of having food in our mouths. Joey finished first, and Howie handed him a crust from his own share. "Here, Joey, you eat this. I hate the crusty part," he lied indifferently. That was like Howie. The rhythmic roar of the wheels soon made us drowsy. There wasn't much to talk about anyway, so we leaned against a high stack of the lime sacks and closed our eyes. Suddenly I remembered what the hobo had said about heavy loads that shifted with a lurching train and sometimes killed riders. I got up and tested the stack above us. It seemed firm as a stone wall. Then I relaxed and went to sleep. It was toward morning, but still dark, when a couple railroad bulls came through our car. One of them kicked me in the shins, not hard, but lively enough to let me know he meant business. "Come on, you kids, you're getting off in just about 15 minutes. You're getting off and staying off, the whole lousy lot of you." One of the men over in the corner gave the bulls some lip. Didn't hear what he said, but I could tell by the tone. "We've had our orders, Bud, and the company ain't foolin'. This train is crawlin' with free riders tonight. You're getting off, brother, and you can wait for the next freight and see what happens." We got off when the freight stopped. It was cold and dark except for the dim lights around the railroad yards. Down the length of the train, we saw men and boys leaping out of the car doors, or climbing down the tops of the cars. I thought about frightened rats running out of the paths of danger. I didn't like being one of those rats. I held on to Joey when he made the leap down from the car. He was sleepy and stiff from the cramped position he'd had, and bewildered about what was happening. Howie swore softly, one hand clutching his banjo and the other hand guiding Joey. There was noise all around us. Noise of the panting freight, of the yelling and cursing of angry men as they milled about the train. Suddenly we became aware of another noise, a swelling roar from the town beyond the tracks. We stopped to listen, and in the near darkness we saw what looked like a wall of men coming towards us. They carried clubs and pitchforks, and as they approached we could hear the savagery in their voices. "Don't take another step this way," a huge man yelled, stepping in front of the others. "You can take your empty bellies to another part of the country. We've enough of your kind to feed already. Take another step and we'll club you down like dogs." There were snarls and yells of rage from our side. A man cried out, "What do you want us to do? Throw ourselves all under the wheels?" And there was a loud chorus of, "Yes, that's right, do that." It was like a horror dream. The thought ran through my mind, Joey's hearing this. He's only 10 and he's hearing things like this. Out of the crowd of men, the hobo from the Chicago yards was suddenly beside us. "You boys stay with me. We'll jump the train as soon as it gets moving. It's all we can do. I'll help the kid on. You two, stay close." And so we waited. It seemed a long time, but finally the signal for pulling out was sounded, and the train started moving. Men ran along its side and waited to make their leap. I think the railroad bulls must have given up. They couldn't afford to club men to death because they were stealing another hour's ride. The hobo lifted Joey like a sack of flour and half-tossed, half-pushed him into the empty car. He yelled to Howie and me, "Stay close. There's a passenger highballing through town on the other track." There was indeed, though I'd been too excited to notice. The light was tearing down the parallel track toward us. It was blinding. I grabbed at the floor of the car and swung up inside. It wasn't hard to do. The freight was still moving slowly. Howie was right behind me, and I braced myself to draw him up. But he didn't leap as I expected him to do. He yelled, "Here, catch my banjo, Josh!" And as I extended my arms, He leaned back a little and threw the banjo up to me. What happened then? I don't know. I'll never know. But the banjo had no sooner touched my hands than I saw Howie's body lifted by the express train and thrown down the tracks as if it had been an empty crate, a worthless piece of junk. I had the wildest kind of feeling that I must go after him. It seemed I'd die if I couldn't get to Howie. I heard Joey screaming and a man yelling, "Grab that kid, he's going to jump." Then it was as if a dozen pairs of arms grabbed me and threw me down on the floor against the side of the car. I didn't know anything more for a long time.